Further debate. I recognize a member from Orleans.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Few things in life are as frustrating as sitting in traffic. I think we can all agree on that. But some of those things that are sitting on a crowded bus, or standing on a crowded bus, or standing on a crowded subway. Sometimes just missing your connection will be that little extra amount of time that makes you late for work and throws the rest of your day into chaos. So it's quite clear, Mr. Speaker, that building new transit across the GTHA will certainly help address some of these challenges. It's why, Mr. Speaker, and in fact, I was reminded the other day that no government in the history of Ontario invested more in transit and transportation than the previous Liberal government, despite what we've heard from some this afternoon. But that doesn't mean that this bill or the process by which the government is moving forward with it and with these projects is without criticism. At committee, there was virtual unanimity that the investment in improving public transit in Toronto and the GTHA was welcome and would benefit Ontario residents. That being said, Mr. Speaker, residents were also clear that they have not felt that their legitimate concerns are being heard by this government. And after seeing every single amendment proposed for this bill rejected outright, I can see their point. We are committed to building public transit in the GTHA and across the province, but there are improvements to be made to how the government and Metrolinx is managing their relationship with the local communities. We heard consistently from members of the public that they have not felt that their voices are being heard. We heard time and again that the consultation process, if you can call it that, has been lacking. The testimony was very clear. The community supports getting on with public transit, but they need to be part of the process. And so we proposed amendments to the bill that would help lead the government in this direction. We proposed an amendment to require the government and Metrolinx to work with the community in a collaborative way. Our amendment would have ensured proper public consultation in the design phase to provide clarity to residents about where exactly these lines are going and the impacts that they might expect to feel within their community. Our amendment would have required that the government and Metrolinx continue that engagement throughout the entirety of the construction process. In her remarks earlier today, Mr. Speaker, the minister recognized that construction would have a significant impact on communities. And this is why we felt it was important for the government and Metrolinx to continue engaging with communities throughout the duration of this generational plan, as someone has called it, to ensure that legitimate concerns about the impact to daily life of construction can be heard and can be addressed. And of course, Mr. Speaker, consultation does not need to be codified in legislation. But we heard time and again that that consultation wasn't happening. And when given the opportunity to ensure that the government was held to a legislated standard, the government for the people didn't feel they should be required to talk or meet the people. I've never understood this hesitation to public consultation, Mr. Speaker. Good management practice and, frankly, good politics dictates that speaking to those you represent is always a good idea. It's a benefit, not a hindrance. Our amendments would have required that the government provide an annual preview of what to expect in construction, to highlight the milestones that are expected to be achieved, and to provide proper notification to affected residents, businesses, municipalities, etc. And again, Mr. Speaker, the government members did not support these amendments. apparently providing a plan of activity, giving us insight as to what would come ahead for the year, and to notify people of that activity was too onerous. It would take too much time. Writing down your plan and communicating it with those that it affects would somehow slow down this multi-generational, multi-billion-dollar mega project. That's actually what we heard from the government. I don't know about everyone else in this chamber, but I've always found that planning out my activity has actually helped me stay on schedule. That those days where everything is going wrong, when you're running behind, where nothing seems to be working properly, are the days that are not well planned out. Good planning in construction speeds up construction. It's that simple. It's a lesson learned over and over and over again. It's not a lesson the government wanted to be included in legislation. Moreover, the publication of this plan provides incentive to the contractors that will eventually be hired to stay on schedule. I've lived through the Ottawa experience of projects that are behind schedule, and the public pressure brought to bear because that schedule is public is enormous, and certainly incentivizes activity and action. But the government didn't believe, and I presume doesn't believe, that this transparency and potential accountability into their project was in their best interest. Finally, Mr. Speaker, we heard from residents that in the few occasions they were allowed or provided to provide their feedback, they felt their voices were being ignored. We heard from members today. They would attend a meeting, they would ask questions, they would provide information, seek answers, and it would be blank faces on the other side, emails that went unresponded, phone calls that were never returned. Metrolinx or the government wasn't interested in hearing their feedback and their complaints. They were checking a box to say that they've done it. And so we proposed an amendment that would require the government to reply to residents about their concerns. Simply put, Mr. Speaker, the amendment would require that Metrolinx acknowledge the concern and provide an answer, and to publish those concerns and those answers on a regular basis so that everyone is aware and everyone could feel confident in the response from their government. In fairness, Mr. Speaker, I don't think this is a very onerous task. In fact, I believe that responding to residents is something we do every day. The government chose not to support these measures that would improve consultation, require proper planning, and would lead to residents to feel that they were part of the process. Now, none of this needs to necessarily be legislated. The minister can require this action to take place. Good management, if it exists at Metrolinx, can insist that these actions be taken, and all of this can be written into project agreements. And so there is still hope, Mr. Speaker, that as we move forward with these projects, the government can choose to listen to the people. The government can choose to get feedback and make changes. The government can choose, make that choice, and I hope they do so, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Questions? I recognize the member from Carleton for
Thank you.
questions.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I listened with intently to the member from Orleans' comments, and it was a little bit confusing, Mr. Speaker, and I just want to put it in perspective. I'd like to congratulate the member for his election. However, when he spoke about his experience and having lived through the Ottawa experience of projects that were on time and on schedule and on budget. It's a little bit shocking to me because the member used to be the chair of the Ottawa Transit Commission, who was responsible for the Ottawa LRT project. So I'd like to, maybe get some clarification from the member on which transportation project he's talking about in his Ottawa experience that was on time and on schedule and on budget. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Back to the member from Orleans for your response.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I think if you were to check Hansard, those words were not spoken by me. I certainly did say that I've lived through the Ottawa experience, and that experience was about the accountability measures that having public information in a contract provides. Publishing milestones that you want to achieve in a year provides that accountability to residents, provides that accountability to the media, so that government and the contractor, the eventual winner of a competitive process, can be held to account to what they're saying they're going to do. The government chose not to build those accountability measures into the legislation. It's not too late. They can put that type of accountability into the project agreement. The minister can direct Metrolinx to include it.
Bonds?
I hope that the minister chooses to include accountability measures in any procurement process.
Very much. Further questions? I recognize the member from Sudbury.
Thank you, Speaker. I want to also thank the member for Orleans for his comments, and also congratulations on your recent election. So as a new MPP myself, I have a question I asked the government. I didn't really get an answer to it, so I'm going to ask it to you. My understanding is that prior to the election, there were plans in place for a subway project in Toronto. After the election, the government ripped those up. And so my background with construction would be their environmental assessments, engineering assessments, safety risk assessments, all kinds of time, energy, and resources poured into that. Does it make any sense to you that the government would say it's quicker and more cost-effective to throw away the plans we have and start from scratch, just with your background with transportation as well?
All right, back to the member from Orleans for a response.
I appreciate that question very well, and in fact, we experienced the same thing in Ottawa, Mr. Speaker. Conservative mayor, backed by Conservative cabinet ministers, ripped up and threw out the first Ottawa LRT project, and the City of Ottawa lost $100 million in real cash, lost a decade of inaction, and lost an infrastructure round, basically leading to $500 million not invested in the nation's capital. So no, I don't believe it's smart to rip up construction projects or projects that have already seen approval, because you do lose a decade. That being said, we cannot continue this process of continually ripping things up and starting over. Otherwise, nothing will ever get done.
Thank you. Further questions, a member from Carleton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just wanted to comment. I actually listened very intently to the member from Orleans' statements, and I invite him to check the Hansard record, because he literally said, and I quote, "I've lived through the Ottawa experience of projects that were on schedule." So I would once again ask the member to explain and maybe give some examples of which Ottawa projects he worked on as Transit Commissioner that were on schedule. Thank you.
Back to the member from Orleans for your response.
Thank you very much, and I don't want to quibble with the member, but I was speaking very specifically to accountability measures within the contract and the pressure that publicizing those milestones and standards to be achieved has on the contractor and on the government to maintain schedule. But in terms of projects that have been on schedule, OC Transpo has had many bus projects, transit projects, park and ride projects that have been on schedule, and I would encourage the local member to communicate with her city councillors in Ottawa if she has any questions about those.
Thank you. Questions? We're going to hear from the member from Windsor-Tecumseh.
Well, thank you, Speaker, and I apologize to the member from Orleans. My back is to him as I'm posing a question to him. When I heard you speak about the government and the problems you were having with the government dealing with the LRT, was that the Liberal government of Ms. Wynne and Mr. McGuinty that you were dealing with? Because transportation takes a long time to plan and to build. And the other thing, if you could clarify for me, I think when I was in Ottawa the last time, I was reading a paper and it talked about in the wintertime the LRT is having trouble through the snow or going up a slight grade in the roadbed, and why wasn't that picked up at some point?
To the member from Orleans for your response.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the question. The challenge with the first iteration of the Ottawa Light Rail Plan was with a Conservative mayor who was elected in 2006 and ripped up, in fact, the Liberal plan to build LRT and was backed by a federal Conservative cabinet minister. This led to lawsuits and the City of Ottawa losing $100 million in real cash and a decade of making progress on public transit. Vis-a-vis the challenges that Ottawa LRT has faced, those are not secret. They're well publicized. There have been challenges throughout the winter. And in fact, the contract, the award-winning contract the City of Ottawa signed with the consortium has protected taxpayers in every way from those eventualities. The consortium that was responsible for building the project was not paid for up to a year, and that's as a result of the innovative procurement process that the City of Ottawa went through.
Thank you very much. Further questions? The member from Carleton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think the record will speak for itself. However, I'd like to move on because if the member was in fact talking about transparency and accountability, then my question to the member is, why was the details of Phase 2 bidding process not revealed, and why did the city not act in a transparent or accountable manner, especially with the member being chair of the Transit Commission, to inform the City of Ottawa and its citizens that the bid did not meet the technical requirements and should have actually been disqualified, and yet it was still approved anyway? Thank you.
You back to the member from Orleans for your response.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And the award-winning contract in P3 that the City of Ottawa went through for Stage 2 of LRT, a project fully endorsed by the government, and when the Premier came to Ottawa to announce the government's funding for this project, espoused the virtues of the Trillium Line and the Confederation Line, and the efforts the city has gone to move LRT forward in our city. And in fact, the details of the Stage 2 contract, redacted for commercially sensitive information, are publicly available.
Very much. Questions? The member from Carleton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think the record will speak for itself. However, I'd like to move on because if the member was in fact talking about transparency and accountability, then my question to the member is, why was the details of Phase 2 bidding process not revealed, and why did the city not act in a transparent or accountable manner, especially with the member being chair of the Transit Commission, to inform the City of Ottawa and its citizens that the bid did not meet the technical requirements and should have actually been disqualified, and yet it was still approved anyway? Thank you.
You back to the member from Orleans for your response.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And the award-winning contract in P3 that the City of Ottawa went through for Stage 2 of LRT, a project fully endorsed by the government, and when the Premier came to Ottawa to announce the government's funding for this project, espoused the virtues of the Trillium Line and the Confederation Line, and the efforts the city has gone to move LRT forward in our city. And in fact, the details of the Stage 2 contract, redacted for commercially sensitive information, are publicly available.
Very much. Further questions? The member from Kingston and the Islands.
Thank you, Speaker. And once again, listening to the debate between the independent Liberal member and the government speakers, I'm struck by one of the key different, well, one of my favorite sayings, Liberal Tory, same old story, but also on the distinction of support for P3s. Because it's something that I do associate with Liberal governments very, very much. And I just want to read from an article here. It says, while the notion of a P3 is intended to encourage collaborative behavior within project consortium and between public and private sectors, in practice, the rigid structure of a typical infrastructure model can inhibit free communication and collaboration. In fact, it stifles innovation. So my question to the member is, does he still stand behind the P3 model, and would he ever consider using it moving forward when we know it costs more to the taxpayers?
Thank you very much. To the member from Orleans for your response.
Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the question. P3s have demonstrated that they can be very effective in some circumstances and perhaps not so effective in others. There is not one rigid black or white answer to the P3 question. Every project needs to be evaluated on its merits, and the financial model and the procurement model chosen to finance it based on those merits.
Thank you. Further questions? The member from Carleton.
Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I was also there at the announcement of the Premier back in October 2018. That was actually well before the details of the problems with the bid were revealed. So my question to the member is, why did the City of Ottawa and you as chair of the Transit Commission approve a technical bid that did not meet the specifications? Thank you.
Back to the member from Orleans.
The City of Ottawa's Auditor General has reviewed the procurement process for Stage 2 Trillium Line and found no irregularities. Thank you.
Thank you very much.